Good morning.
Morning.
This listening session of the Committee on House Administration of the U.S. House of Representatives will come to order. My name is Marcia Fudge. I'm the subcommittee chair, and I want to thank all of you and all of my colleagues for joining us today. I especially want to thank Congressman Vela for welcoming us to this district of his in a very, very warm way. We thank you, sir. I want to thank the staff, the chair of this committee, Zoe Lofgren, the speaker for having the insight to allow us to go across this country to determine what is going on really as it relates to voting rights. I also want to thank our distinguished group of experts for being here today. For the statements that you will provide, we are excited to hear from you. It is critical to have your input, and we are excited to hear it. We are here to talk about the Voting Rights Act. More specifically, we are here to talk about why we still need its protections and why it is so critical that Congress pass a new coverage formula so that we can make Section 5 work again to ensure all eligible voters have access to the ballot. When the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County, they struck down more than just a formula. They struck down the idea that all eligible Americans should have the right to vote. They allowed states to implement restrictive laws that deny the most vulnerable among us. They took away their voice. They enabled bad actors to deny Americans their fundamental rights. And they allowed elected officials to pick their voters. The record we compiled today and in the coming months will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that we still need the Voting Rights Act. It will prove that while we've come so far, we have so far to go. Someone asked me, why Texas and why Brownsville? I will say it in the words of Dr. King. We are here because injustice is here. It is our first step in making right the wrongs that have disenfranchised too many for far too long. I look forward to the valuable insight that will be provided today and working with all the stakeholders that have done so much good work around this issue. I would now ask that our members have a few words of welcome. I would start with Chairman Benny Thompson of the Homeland Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me welcome my colleagues who are on the dais with me, as well as panel of witnesses today. I look forward to your testimony. And you wonder, why would a Homeland Security guy have anything to do with elections? As some of you might know, our system of elections has been declared critical infrastructure. And so it's in our best interest to protect that infrastructure, which is also meant that we have to protect how we elect our officials. But in any democracy, you have to be fair and impartial. That's the real hallmark of any democracy. So I look forward to the testimony. My personal testimony is long time ago, Benny Thompson ran for office, and the only reason he was able to win was because of the Voting Rights Act protections. We couldn't even register people to vote in my little community unless they were federally registered. The local registrar wouldn't even register them. So there are a lot of things that I have real commitment to, and this is one. So the other thing is, we produced a report, a task force report on our committee talking about elections in this country. It's not just the person down the street. The Russians, the Chinese, North Koreans, other people would want to compromise our systems also for election. So my mission is election security, and so I'm happy to be here, Madam Chair, and I look forward to the testimony and the questions to follow.
Thank you very, very much. We would now move to Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson of the Science and Technology Committee, and a Texan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me acknowledge our host, Mr. Vela, and my other colleagues who are here, and to the distinguished panelists, as well as the audience. I'm a native Texan, and that says it all in terms of voting rights. I'm delighted that this committee has chosen this as a first stop. I think it was a correct stop to make. We have just been accused of allowing non-citizens into the thousands to vote, which I think will be proven not to be accurate. But we know that we must watch voters and voting of minorities for protection very closely in Texas and in the United States. But Texas is one of those states that's very important to the fairness and justice of all voters, especially minorities. I'm delighted that the leadership of this Congress has made this a priority, and I look forward to seeing the results of all the hearings throughout the nation. I don't see too many faces that are foreign, and I think it's because those people who are interested in voting rights will always show up when we need them. So thanks to all of you. We are especially pleased to be the guest of Congressman Vela, who is well known in this area, with his mother having been mayor of the city and his father having been a federal judge. He has to stand up straight because he's from good blood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we would hear from the Assistant Speaker and my classmate, Ben Ray Lujan.
I thank the chair. Seized every opportunity to rig the rules of our democracy in their favor. We've seen the diminishing and suppressing of voters. In many states across America in recent years, we saw polling places get closed, the shortening of voting hours. We saw the implementation of burdensome ID laws, and then those same very actors made it more difficult to obtain the required IDs. They purged registered voters from the polls, made registration more onerous, gerrymandered districts for political gain across America. And so we're here because we need answers to these injustices with reforms that restore and protect the voice of the American people in our democracy. And I hope that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will come to the table and help us restore power to the American people. Here's something to remember. Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush all renewed and strengthened the Voting Rights Act. The late Republican Senator John McCain joined with progressives Senator Russ Feingold to pass the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the most significant update of our campaign finance law since Watergate. In response to the lobbying scandals of the mid-2000s, 411 bipartisan members of the House and 83 bipartisan senators passed an ethics reform bill that George W. Bush signed into law. But make no mistake, if our Republican-led Senate and the President choose not to help fix our democracy, we'll look to the American people. I thank you very much for your time today and very much look forward to the testimony.
Thank you. We would now hear from our host, Philemon Vela.
Thank you, Congressman Fudge, and thank all of my colleagues for joining us here in South Texas today. I think this is probably one of the first, it's not officially a congressional hearing because some of our committees have not yet formed, but our first listening session in this new session of Congress. And I think the idea that our leader in this effort, Congressman Fudge, would be willing to host this in my home county it's a great honor to have you and everybody else here. You know, I was born 2 years before the implementation or the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which occurred in 1965. And I'm in a building that I practically grew up in because my father had a law practice directly across the street. As a state trial judge, he was in these buildings for about 5 years. But like many good politicians, his political career began in defeat. And that was back in 1962 when he had to confront the poll tax. And so I remember over the years how my father would, he of course blamed his defeat on the poll tax. It's difficult to tell whether that was the reason or not. But those of us who came of age after the passage of the Voting Rights Act came in a different, were raised in a different world. And so the idea that we are at a place in this country where there are people that think that we should make it more difficult to vote when we should be doing the exact opposite is just, it's just striking, and it's unfortunate. And with our new leadership in the House, with Speaker Pelosi in charge, I am hoping that we can move forward and do the right thing for the citizens of this country who face obstacles in exercising their right to vote, and that we can break that wide open. And thanks to all of our witnesses for being here as well today. And finally, thanks to our hosts, Cameron County Commissioners Court, Judge Eddie Trevino, and our County Administrator David Garcia for allowing us to use this beautiful space, and to our former County Judge Gilberto Hinojosa for being here as well.
Thank you. Another Texan, my friend from Houston, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chairwoman for her astuteness of making this the first place to hold this very crucial hearing and listening session. I want to acknowledge the chairwoman of the House Administration Committee, Zoe Lofgren, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, for recognizing the crucialness of voting for there will be many hearings thereafter. And Congressman Vela, thank you so very much for being a host. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues, Congressman Green and Chairwoman Johnson, Chairman Thompson, and the Assistant Speaker, as well as my colleague, Mr. Cuellar. I can say to you that the crucialness of this committee cannot be spoken enough of. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, senior member, the work that we will do will be in collaboration with the important work of this great committee. I cannot speak without acknowledging the warriors that you have selected, the experts, Rolando Rios and George Corbel, as well as Mr. Bledsoe, who I don't know will be able to be here, Mr. Dunn, and certainly our representative from the ACLU, who is present. All of these gentlemen I have had the opportunity to work with, and Ms. Marzano, we thank you as well for the leadership that will be given to this hearing. Very briefly, we are at the epicenter of voting discrimination here in the state of Texas. And just 2 points, many more to be offered, but certainly those of us in the United States Congress are the beneficiaries of the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 5 preclearance. We're in voting rights districts. Many of us are in voting rights district. The district that I am in now is a court-ordered district, done so out of a long-standing discrimination that we had to fight from the very time I came to the United States Congress. I've never been totally in a district drawn by the state legislature. I only survived. This district only came about. Barbara Jordan was only elected because of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So 2 points. Isn't it interesting that the Department of Justice has now indicated that the state of Texas should be withdrawn from any Section 5 preclearance? And number 2, that the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund has to file suit because the state of Texas, besides its discriminatory voter ID law, which has saw the closing of polling places, but now that they are holding up individuals whose driver's license may have indicated that they were not a citizen, but in fact they are a citizen. You get a driver's license in this state, no matter who you are, but you then process into citizenship. If we want to believe in one person, one vote, government of and by and for the people, then we must guard, protect, hold, and fight for voting rights, including Section 5. So thank you so very much. I close by acknowledging our chairman, very active gentleman, Mr. Hinojosa. We're very grateful for your leadership. And Ms. Belt, who is here, we're very grateful for her service. So thank you very much, madam, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The Texan at the end of the dais, my friend Henry Cuellar, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for having this hearing, this field hearing here in South Texas. And I certainly want to say welcome to you and the other members that are present here today that have come to visit Texas and how special South Texas and the border is. Certainly want to thank my good friend Filemon Vela for being our host. Mr. Vela has been an outstanding member of Congress. As you know, he's part of the team. It's if you look at South Texas, you have Congressman Vela, Congressman Gonzalez, and myself, three of us in South Texas, and we work together as a team. So thank you, Mr. Vela, for hosting us and for the great job that you're doing in D.C. And certainly what I want to say is start off with the witnesses. I know some of those witnesses. We worked for many years. In fact, a couple of them are my redistricting attorneys. And if there's anybody that knows the redistricting law, it's certainly Rolando Rios, who's been working on it, I guess, since the 80s or so. And then you got George Corbo, my other friend there, who's been working on this, I guess, since 1971, if I'm correct. So if there's anybody who knows redistricting or the Voting Rights Act, it's those two gentlemen. But along we got our experts also from the ACLU. Thank you so much for being here. Mr. Dunn, again, you worked for a good friend of mine, Rodney Ellis, Senator Ellis, and Donna Dukes, and the other friends that I worked with in the state legislature, so I certainly want to thank you. Gary's not here, Bledsoe, and he's another good friend that knows it very well, and I certainly want to thank the witnesses. Before I go into to the judge and the former county judge, let me just say, the attorneys that are here were the ones who were involved in another issue that was very important. Citizenship, the question. And they won this first step, and I hope we can win it, because if there's anything that's going to cost the state of Texas, not only members of Congress or other areas, it's going to be the billions of dollars that the state of Texas and other states are going to lose. And this is why it should be a no-brainer that we shouldn't be doing that. But unfortunately, sometimes people will put the politics in front of what's right for the community. So I certainly want to say congratulations for winning this extremely important case itself also. Certainly, the county judge, thank you so much, Judge Trevino, for hosting us here, and send my best to the county commissioners, and thank you for everything you do. Former county judge also in the host, we've known each other for a long time, and thank you for what you do also for the state of Texas. And certainly they know, these are the folks that know South Texas very well. So again, I want to hear from the witnesses. All I want to say, Madam Chair, thank you so much for hosting us here, and to your staff that's been working very hard to make sure that we have this field hearing here in the state of Texas. And again, it's important to come down here to the border because, as you know, Chairman, yesterday I hosted as part of the conferees 3 other folks, and they keep talking about the wall, which we don't want. This is the type of hearing we should have on the border. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And last and certainly not least, my other friend from Texas, sitting at the end of the table, Representative Al Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank you for your leadership. I thank you for your courage. And most importantly, I thank you for just being a good, decent person. Someone who has the ability to see wrong and to challenge it consistently. So I thank you. I thank all of my honorable colleagues, and I'm honored to be here for this historic occasion, proud to be a part of it. I'm here because Dr. King was eminently correct. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it doesn't do it on its own volition. It does it because people of goodwill will take up the cause of justice. I'm here with my colleagues to help bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. I believe that pre-clearance paved the way for political inclusion. Without pre-clearance, the face of Congress would be decidedly different. We have benefited greatly, and it's a shame that we find ourselves now having to refight the fights that we won, but it's our duty to do so. Briefly this, no more than 24 hours after the decision was made in Shelby, Texas immediately announced its intention to implement a strict voter ID law. Mississippi and Alabama followed quickly, and then, of course, 2 months later, we had North Carolina. We have a duty, a responsibility, and an obligation to the people who made it possible for us to have these positions to take up this cause of justice. And I promise you, I'm honored to be here, but I'm honored to also be a part of the fight. I yield back.
Thank you very much. As you can see, we have a distinguished group of members here who are very interested and concerned about what is happening in this country today as it relates to voting rights. I would now ask, at least introduce all of the panel. You know your role. You've got 5 minutes each. You know the light system, green. When it goes to yellow, that means you have 1 minute left. When it turns red, that means it's time to wrap up. Mr. Rolando Rios, who has concentrated his entire career principally in federal and state election law, equal protection, redistricting, and governmental affairs. We thank you, sir, for being here. You will be first to testify. Mr. George Corbel, who is a veteran civil rights attorney who has fought for the minority voting rights in Texas for more than 4 decades. Mr. Matthew McCarthy, from the ACLU Foundation of Texas. We welcome you as well, sir. And last to testify will be Chad Dunn. Chad Dunn has handled numerous trials and appellate matters related to voting and civil rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Chairwoman Fudge and committee members. It's an honor to present testimony today in support of amending and strengthening the Federal Voting Rights Act. My name is Rolando Rios. I am a voting rights attorney in private practice here in Texas. My practice in voting rights started immediately after graduating from Georgetown Law. I have been doing voting litigation for the past 35 years, mostly as a private practitioner, working with the NAACP, MALDEF, Southwest Voters, Legal Aid, and other public interest groups. My office has been involved in over 250 voting rights cases in Texas. The list of cases is attached to my testimony along with a map identifying where that litigation occurred. I hasten to add that we had a 95% success rate because of the Voting Rights Act. The great success was not because we're such great lawyers, but because of the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act. The act eliminated at-large voting in Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Waco, Lubbock, Midland, and Odessa, just to name a few cities in Texas. After the 2013 Shelby case, the success rate dropped dramatically and turned the dogs loose, so to speak, on the minority community by enabling the passage of some of the most repressive state voting laws. We need immediate action from Congress to combat the adverse effects of the Shelby case. There is now a continued all-out assault on the right to vote by the state of Texas against Latinos and African Americans. This all-out assault started in 1994 after the effects of Ronald Reagan's immigration bill that allowed millions of Latinos to become citizens. After the 1994 elections, the Republican Party realized that 70 to 80% of the new Latino citizens were voting for Democrats. At that point, the Republicans declared, "We have an immigration problem." As the Republicans took over Congress for the first time in 30 years, there has been a continued drumbeat of, we have an immigration problem. No, we don't. We do not have an immigration problem. The problem is that the Republican Party refuses to add the issues of importance, address the issues of importance to the minority community, and instead have decided to pursue a sinister and illegal strategy of denying minorities the right to vote. This is why we need congressional action. Since the Shelby decision, the assault on the right to vote in Texas has intensified as follows, for example. The city of Odessa, whom we sued in 1985, challenging at-large elections and won in federal court, ordering the creation of single-member districts. This year, as the minority community became stronger and minority control was looming, the city passed a charter amendment reinstating at-large voting. This would never have happened before Shelby. The voter ID law was passed after Shelby, and after years of litigation, was declared unconstitutional by the federal courts. This law would never have been passed in the first place by Texas before Shelby. Last, this past week, Secretary of State of Texas sent letters questioning the voter registration of 95 mostly Latino naturalized voters. Texas went back to 1996 to identify naturalized voters. These are individuals that were in this country legally and obtained driver's licenses before they became naturalized. After they naturalized, they registered to vote and have been voting consistently. With no substantive facts or factual basis, now Texas wants them to produce naturalization papers. This is clearly an intent to intimidate and harass Latino voters. I predict that this strategy against naturalized citizens voters will continue throughout the country. Also, judicial findings of intentional discrimination have increased since Shelby. A court declaring a state action as intent to discriminate was a rare occurrence in this country. Courts usually attempt to resolve voting litigation without getting into constitutional findings. For example, in 2011, Texas Congressional Redistricting Plan split the African American and Hispanic communities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area into 7 different Anglo-controlled congressional districts. I have a map here just to illustrate the point. The area in the outline in the dark line is the minority area in the Dallas area. This minority area was split into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different districts. So they would be controlled by Anglo districts. This area here, the court called it a lightning bolt that went down here and picked up the Latinos from Tarrant County and put them up in Denton so that they couldn't have a right to vote. And Congressional District 30, and we're familiar with Congressional District 30, was already 81% Latino and African American, and they increased it to 85%, basically eviscerating the minority community. This is the kind of outward and aggressive action that is continuing to occur. Finally, in the Perez case, which is the congressional redistricting case, the court found that the map drawers acted with an impermissible intent to dilute minority voting strength. The court found intentional packing and cracking against minorities. Every decade since 1970. Okay, all right. And I'll submit the rest of my testimony. We had been told that it was going to be 10 minutes. That's why it went over. No problem. Thank you.
I think we are saying a total of 10, but it would be 5 minutes of testimony and 5 minutes of questioning.
Okay, no question. No problem.
Mr. Corbell.
My name is George Corbell. I had the distinct pleasure of being involved in putting the case together to extend the Voting Rights Act to cover Texas back in 1975. And I want to do two things here. I want to discuss what we were facing in 1975, what the obstacles were, and then I want to demonstrate that those obstacles are almost exactly the same, that there is very little change. I've also had the opportunity of preparing several of you for testimony and various hearings, and I've handled White versus Register. I was the lead counsel for the Hispanics in White versus Register, and I handled litigation against for single-member districts in the city of Houston, the city of San Antonio, the city of Waco, and several dozen other cities in the state. The last time this committee came to Texas was in 1982 for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1982. And I sat at a table like this in Austin, and sitting right here to my left was the head of elections in Texas under our first Republican governor since Reconstruction, Doug Caddy. And Doug Caddy and I came from a meeting with the governor earlier in the day, and the governor said, absolutely, we're in favor of continuing the Voting Rights Act. Doug Caddy was one of the founders of the Federalist Society. He was a consummate Republican conservative, but he believed that everybody ought to have the right to vote. There are several attachments that I have. One I want to point out is that in 1975, when we put the pitch together for Congress, we dealt with 8 cases, or 6 cases, depending on how you analyzed it, but at the most 8 cases. And then another area which was discouraging people to vote. Texas had, now I've attached to the statement a 350-page list of cases. We now have more than 400 cases in which either we have administrative findings of discrimination, voting discrimination, or judicial findings of voting discrimination. And I urge you to take a look at a little bit of it. The first 85 pages deal with the previous 20 years in Texas, and it adds about 110 of these cases. And when we prepared the extension in 1975, we looked at the 20-year period before. The next thing that I've attached is deals with, in fact, I used part of the document that I used back in 1975. The question was, Texas is not part of the South. Texas is very different, and that's what the argument went. Well, I've got a short list of all of the cases. Texas was exactly the same as all the other jurisdictions in the South, except we didn't have a grandfather clause. We didn't have those sorts of things because we had a statute that said blacks couldn't vote. And that was litigated up through the 50s. That issue was litigated up through the 50s. The other thing I want to point out in the less time that I've got is that the other issue that we were dealing with was discouraging people to vote, and there were 2 areas in that. One was a complete purge. Texas had passed a complete purge of all the registered voters, which was going to take place in 1975. We stopped that. The same purge is going on now. Exactly the same thing. And I want you to take a look at the charts that I put in. In 1975, when we dealt with this the first time, Anglos, as we call white people in Texas, Anglos, were 2/3 of the population. Blacks and Hispanics made up 1/3. Today, blacks and Hispanics are almost 2/3 of the population, and Anglos are less than that. And let me make one more point. In 1975, when we dealt with this before, there were 4 congressional districts in which Hispanics had the power to elect. 4 congressional districts out of 24. That's 16%. Today, there are 6 out of 36. That's 16%. Exactly the same. It hasn't changed. And the reason for that is because of the gerrymanders. Now, Rolando talked about it being the congressional districts in Dallas and Fort Worth were split in 8 ways. The only district that's contained wholly within the district is the congressman's district within Dallas County. Otherwise, they go all the way all over the state. So.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I just want to make you aware that we are going to keep the record open for at least 2 weeks, so that if there's other information that you want to submit to us, you'll have 2 weeks to do that. But I do want to make sure that we can have questions, because there's so many questions I want to ask. Mr. McCarthy.
Good morning. My name is Matthew McCarthy, and I'm here on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Foundation of Texas. The ACLU of Texas thanks you for the opportunity to testify today on this very important issue and applauds the reinstatement of this subcommittee, given the importance of combating voter suppression and encouraging electoral reform efforts that are directed at protecting the right to vote and also making it easier for citizens to register to vote and to cast their ballot. Voting is the cornerstone of our democracy, and it is the fundamental right upon which all of our civil liberties rest. Through litigation and advocacy, the ACLU of Texas has fought and continues to fight back against attempts to curtail the right to vote. Despite our best efforts and those of other organizations and attorneys represented here today, politicians in Texas and across the country continue to pass laws that suppress the right to vote by imposing obstacles to registration, cutbacks on early voting, and strict voter identification requirements, among other impediments. I'd like to focus today on 2 examples of the way in which the right to vote in Texas is being curtailed, and I'll start with the voter identification laws that have already been mentioned. The voter ID laws in Texas were introduced immediately following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, and they require voters to present one of 7 approved forms of government-issued identification before being allowed to vote. If a voter doesn't have one of the approved forms of identification, he or she can sign a declaration attesting under penalty of perjury that there is a reasonable impediment to having one of those forms of approved IDs. The voter ID laws were the subject of extensive litigation and were found by 3 district courts to have disproportionately burdened voters of colour, and that was because of evidence that minorities are generally less likely to have one of the forms of approved ID, and also less able to obtain one of those forms of approved ID given the cost in terms of time and money in getting one. However, the current form of the ID law was ultimately approved by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and was in place in time for the midterm elections last year. Now, the ACLU of Texas, together with the Texas Civil Rights Project and other organizations, worked as part of a coalition during the election last year to protect the right of Texans to vote. As part of that coalition, we had call centres staffed by trained volunteer attorneys taking calls from around the state, and we also had a number of field volunteers working at polling locations assisting voters with queries. What we found through that process was a significant amount of confusion and misinformation about the voter ID requirements. To give some examples, we heard reports of voters attending polling locations in rural Texas where election officials posted a sign saying, "Must have driver's license to vote." Other reports in some of our large metro areas were of poll workers telling folks who were lining up to vote that you needed to have photo ID or you wouldn't be permitted to vote. This is plainly incorrect under the law, and while we were able to address it, you do wonder how many voters saw that sign or were given that information and simply turned away and didn't exercise their right to vote. And that's a particular concern in polling locations where there are long lines. People aren't going to line up and vote if they think their vote won't be counted. Similarly, a voter in Houston called to tell us that she'd presented her United States passport only to be told that this was not a valid form of ID. Again, plainly incorrect. We also received reports from voters who didn't have an approved form of ID and asked to make a reasonable impediment declaration, only to be challenged by election workers, sometimes aggressively, about the reasons why they didn't have an approved form of ID. What these examples demonstrate is the difficulty voters face in navigating the voter ID laws and the magnification of those difficulties which arises when election officials are poorly trained or in some circumstances see their role as questioning and intimidating voters who don't have one of the approved forms of government ID. Not only does this place a real burden on voters, particularly minority voters, but we fear that in many cases, voters will simply accept what they're being told and will turn away and won't cast their ballot. The second issue I wanted to touch on briefly is the voter purge exercise that's been announced and has been discussed briefly already. On January 25, the Texas Secretary of State issued an advisory to all election officials around the state, informing them that his office had been working with the Texas Department of Public Safety to identify potential non-citizens who are registered to vote. The Secretary said that his office had identified 95,000 such individuals, 58,000 of whom had cast a ballot at some point in the last 20 years. The Secretary generated his list by using information provided by the Department of Public Safety about individuals who at the time of applying for a Texas driver's license had given indication indicating they were a non-citizen. When those individuals were located on the voter rolls, counties were told they should investigate whether those individuals were eligible to vote by sending a notice of examination requiring them to provide documentary proof of their citizenship, and if they didn't respond within 30 days, their registration would be cancelled. Of course, the biggest flaw in this exercise is that no attempt was made to identify people who became citizens and registered to vote after they applied for their Texas driver's license. I see the time, so I'll conclude my remarks there.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here today, and I'm honored to be at this table with these gentlemen and invited here with this lady who I consider to be heroes of my state. I have been a civil rights lawyer here in Texas for almost 20 years. I currently also serve as an adjunct lecturer at UCLA and a co-director of its Voting Rights Project. I've represented the State Democratic Party as my honor since 2003 and its current chairman, Gilberto Hinojosa. And I have been in the middle of many of these election fights that you've heard of and some more that you'll hear of today and elsewhere. I was asked to come here today and talk to you about the material effects of the Shelby County decision, and so I'm going to tell you a story from my perspective. I happen to have been in the Supreme Court chamber when the U.S. Supreme Court issued the Shelby County decision, and there was a majority, if not a quorum, of American civil rights heroes in the courtroom. And as the clerk announced that Chief Justice Roberts has the opinion, you could hear the weeps in the chamber, and you knew what was coming next. And although I can't be sure, I thought I saw tears on some Supreme Court justices. But some of these gentlemen and others that I was there with knew immediately what the effects would be, and unfortunately they were so. As I stepped outside of the courthouse and retrieved my phone, the Supreme Court doesn't allow you to take your phone in there, and turned it on, the first thing I learned, Congressman Green, was then Attorney General Abbott's tweet that voter ID laws would be in effect in Texas, despite the fact that a three-judge court in Washington, D.C. had found the law to be discriminatory, and that court was made up of judges appointed by diverse presidents. This state decided to move forward because, as it saw it, Shelby County opened the gates. Over the course of the next 36 hours, I drafted a lawsuit on behalf of Congressman Vesey, and others filed a lawsuit here in Texas. We were joined by many other soldiers of the civil rights community, and over a period of years, we were able to beat back part of the voter ID law in Texas. But nevertheless, there remains a process of separate but unequal voting for people who don't have the means to have a photo ID, which are estimated to be approximately 950,000 registered voters in Texas. But there were other effects that don't get as much attention as redistricting or voter ID, and those are the events that I'd like to speak with you a bit about. I had been involved in a case when Shelby County came down in Beaumont, Texas, the Beaumont School District. And it would take quite some time to lay out the sordid events in Beaumont, so I'll grossly oversimplify it. But essentially, the district has been majority black in voting population since the 1980s. But it was an integrated school district until 1985 under Brown versus Board of Education. And it ultimately took a series of court decisions until the 1990s to give blacks legitimate right to vote for their school board. A majority of blacks served in that school board before Shelby County came down, but white citizens had managed to get a ballot initiative to force at-large voting in the school district. And the state courts had ordered the school district to go to partial at-large voting. This would have had the results of putting the whites in charge of the school district, despite it being majority black. A federal court in Washington, D.C., under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, in a case I was involved in, enjoined that change. It made the school district stay as it had been ordered by previous federal courts. After Shelby County, all that was undone. And as we sit here today, the school board in Beaumont still does not have, in my opinion, an elected board that represents its community. Also, as I stepped outside of the courthouse, I received a phone call from a friend of mine in Galveston, where we had obtained an injunction under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to prevent the elimination of Justice of the Peace and Constable districts that has historically elected African American and Latino candidates of choice. The county had decided on a budgetary matter to reduce the number of districts, and despite the fact that most growth in the county were black and Hispanic, it was those districts they chose to eliminate. We had stopped that under Section 5. Once Shelby County was issued, the county immediately implemented it. Those offices do not exist now. And although there's a Section 2 lawsuit pending, it's been pending for 5+ years, and there's no yet a resolution in sight. And finally, I want to talk about Jasper, Texas, where James Byrd was gruesomely drugged to his death in a hate crime in the 1990s. Every time I drive through Jasper, I see his grave, and it has to have extraordinary security mechanisms because even to this day, it's vandalized by white citizens in that community. In Jasper, the community decided to vote at large to remove a districted office. So imagine, for example, all citizens of the United States could vote to remove one of you. And they were successful because the city was majority white. A black city council person was removed. Because the Voting Rights Act has been so harmed by the Supreme Court and other judicial decisions, there was nothing we were able to do with that. This city council person was removed. So there's redistricting, there's voter registration, there's countless polling place changes, and it's scary to think, but there are scores of other changes we don't even know about that can't be done or dealt with because of the injury to Section 5. So I appreciate the important work you're doing, and I thank you very much for allowing me to present to you.
I thank all of you. This has been some of the best testimony I have heard in some time, and I thank you for that. We're going to open it up for questions, and I'm just going to let, in the same order that they spoke, if they have a question, we'll just go in that order. I do want to ask one question just off the top, since my colleagues continue to talk about voter fraud. Do you see a lot of voter fraud?
Almost none.
Okay. I just want to be sure, because that's the narrative. It's not violations of the Voting Rights Act. It's voter fraud is what is the narrative coming at from my colleagues in Washington.
I think that's right. I mean, I think all of the available evidence shows that in-person voter fraud in particular is exceptionally rare. And notwithstanding that, we're currently seeing attempts to provide additional funding to the Texas Attorney General's so-called voter fraud unit. So there is that narrative that's out there, but it's just not reflected in the actual evidence.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Well, I think the testimony has been quite revealing in the sense that Texas is trying to act like Mississippi in voter suppression and other things. The question that I think we are tasked to address is, we have to get the record. The voluminous document that you presented, we absolutely need all of that, because one of the reasons we got to where we are today is the court said, for whatever reason, in Shelby there wasn't enough of a record to justify the position, which some of us obviously disagree with. The question is, we're on a short time frame. I think we're tasked to be by June to have these sessions over with. And just as a comment, if you have any idea of what's going on out here in the hinterlands, let us know, because we want to make sure the record is perfected to the point that no stones are unturned. The challenge for a lot of us is the notion of packing and stacking in terms of redistricting, the uniqueness of voter suppression that's going on in areas. My state just attempting to reduce the number of days that a person can clear up any question of residency from 5 days to 2. And you have to clear it up in person. You can't do it electronically or anything, so I might have to go take another day off work to just prove who I am and where I reside. Somebody said, well, what's wrong with that? Well, in my district, we don't have public transportation. So I'm going to have to, in addition to take off work, go to an additional expense of trying to prove that I'm a registered voter. So those challenges, how small they might seem, tamp down participation. And so I guess to Mr. Coble, you've been out here a long time. So are you seeing purges taking place in communities now? You know, under the Voting Rights Act, it's something, if you were federally registered, they used to say they couldn't take you off the road.
Well, in some senses, the voter ID law is a purge. Because what we're doing is we're essentially doing away with voter registration and changing it to driver's licenses or Texas IDs. Now, it doesn't sound like that's a big deal, but an awful lot of people have parking tickets or minor violations. They don't want to go anywhere near the DPS because they're going to get arrested and they're going to spend time in jail. And so we were essentially purging our rolls. And there's also talk in the legislature about another whole purge, like was being proposed when we got the Voting Rights Act in '75. Mm-hmm. I think there were 7 million letters stamped, ready to go out when the court issued the injunction, the first injunction under Section 5, to stop that purge.
So the other point I want to make, and I'll ask real quick, are you aware of any of this so-called voter fraud taking place? Do you all have any? Because some of what we are being told is we're doing these things to protect the integrity of elections and all of that. So are you all aware of that taking place for a majority of the people we're talking about?
I'm not aware of any voter fraud. There may be an election contest here or there where they can prove somebody might have taken somebody's ballot and brought it in absentee, something like that, but no widespread voter fraud whatsoever.
I mean, there are some isolated instances that we've seen where the Texas Attorney General has taken action against people for voter fraud and has secured some convictions, but generally speaking, the circumstances of those cases are mistaken understanding about when you can vote, for example, when you're coming off a felony conviction, people just misunderstanding the requirements and not purposely intending to commit voter fraud.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add, I agree with that assessment. There is some limited in-person voter fraud, and the laws are significant and adequate to deal with them, and does deal with them. Where there is some legitimate voter fraud is mail-in ballots. But the perception here in Texas is that white citizens, the political perception here in Texas is that white citizens avail themselves of the mail-in ballot than do other citizens of color. So our legislature has, at least thus far, chosen to not do anything about that type of voter fraud, and instead has, chased the boogeyman under the bed, so to speak, on these limited circumstances of in-person voter fraud.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you very much. Let me thank all of you for being here. In 1992, when I went to Congress, there were 30 members of the delegation. 21 were Democrats. Less than a decade, this reversed, and it continues to be reversed, even though the minority population has grown tremendously since then. And we now have 36 seats, but the ratio is about the same as it changed. The first big court type of redistricting in the mid-census. And we are still electing statewide elected officials of the party that's not the party's choice of minorities. Do you think it's voter suppression in the state that influences that, or are there pockets in our rural areas that are not performing because of not having more contact perhaps with persons of their voting choice?
I definitely think that's a lot of the reason. I mean, there's been decades worth of efforts to suppress the vote, and they've been effective. So a lot of people have gotten the message, unfortunately. I'm not wanted at the polling place, so I don't go. So there's a lot of that, unfortunately, which the Voting Rights Act was helping to repair. Other problems, of course, is a lack of competitive elections. The districts are so badly gerrymandered that there are very few places where there is a competitive election, and that further discourages people from turning out. And we saw consistent and across the state incredible growth in turnout this last electoral cycle when we had a marquee race for U.S. Senate here in Texas. And so it goes to show that when you have legitimate competitive elections, you can overcome some of the voter apathy that we see, but the decades of voter suppression are going to have to be dealt with.
Do you think that where the voting place is located has any influence? It's been a while ago, but one of my former House colleagues came to Dallas from East Texas and said they had placed the polling place at the jail and that the minorities just stopped voting. Is there a reason to, is there any protection for that kind of thing? I know with the absence of Voting Rights Act, you don't have to get clearance when changes are made now. But do we document that? Does that make a difference in the courts?
Let me answer the question this way. One of the advantages of Section 5 was that we got notice that all this stuff was going on. The Department of Justice would publish a notice, I think weekly, of all the submissions they had gotten so we could look at and see where these polling place changes were made. Now none of that's taking place. And you know how big Texas is. There's no way that we can be in every one of our 254 counties, and except under Section 5 when we got this,
Yes.
this early notice. And the result of that is we have 254 counties. There are 60 counties that have more than a third minority population that don't have a minority county commissioner. And those are all because of a gerrymander. And if you go outside of well, in 1975, of course, there were no black county commissioners. And I think probably every one of the 30 black commissioners we have now, I can show you the lawsuit that brought them in there.
Yes. It is interesting that the precision of which this gerrymandering has been done has come since the use of computers. So has that worked for us or against us?
The other side has a lot more money and a lot more time and a lot more people, and it really works against us.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cuellar is going to have to leave us. He is handling a little thing like whether we need a wall on the border, so he's going to leave us shortly. So, Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I just want to, first of all, thank all the members here and Mr. Vela for hosting us here. Let me first say what Mr. Corbo said, first time since 1982 that the committee has been here, so I just want to thank you for providing that leadership. Three quick points that have been brought up. Number one, the last time we had a redistricting, Texas grew by 4.3 million individuals. 65% were Hispanics. You add the African Americans and other minorities, 90% of the growth that we had were minorities. And as you know, the legislature wanted to do it the other way. They wanted 4-0 and none for the minorities. And again, because of this, attorneys were able to at least get 2 and 2. So if y'all can mention how many congressional Hispanics or Hispanic have grown since the last 50 years, I think it was 14% and 16. But if I can just bring up 2 more questions. The voter ID, things don't just happen in Texas by accident. I mean, there is a plan to do redistricting, voter ID, everything else. If you remember the way they did the voter ID, this card would have not allowed me to vote. This is a U.S. House of Representative card ID. This would have rejected me, would have not allowed me to vote. I would have to get a Texas driver license. The problem was in some areas, there's some counties out of the 254 that have no DPS office. And if they had to travel miles and miles and miles. So if y'all can comment, I know it's been adjusted a bit. The other thing is, let me give you my perspective. I was a Texas Secretary of State, and I want to address the point about voter fraud. When I was there as a Texas Secretary of State, the issue of voter fraud was brought up. Maybe you have a case or other, and they blow it up and make it sound that there's rampant voter fraud. As the Texas Secretary of State when I was there, we didn't have that type of situation. It was just they take one case, they take a politiquera, they take a mail-in, and they make it sound like everybody is committed voter fraud here. So those are the points, and be happy if they can talk about those 3 points. Yeah, we got the North Carolina situation now itself.
In 1975, we had 24 congressmen. Had the minority population in Texas grown at the same rate as the Anglo population, today we would have 23 congressmen. We would have lost a congressman. Instead, we've picked up 16 congressmen, and it's all as a result of minority growth. And I told you that there were 16% in 75 and there's 16% today. That the only reason we got to 16% is because we had to litigate to get Congressman Vichy's district in the Dallas and Fort Worth. Had we not gotten that, we wouldn't even be at 16. So it's
I could just make a couple of very brief comments about your other points. On the question of acceptable forms of ID, I think I've seen some statistics that say that around 11% of Texans don't have one of the approved forms of ID, and that 11% of the population is overwhelmingly made up of minority communities. And I think I've also seen some data that shows that the cost of getting an approved form of ID can be anywhere between $75 or $175, which is a significant amount of money for many people. The other thing I wanted to mention is in relation to your comment about there being a plan. We're seeing that right now with the voter purge exercise that's going on with the Texas Secretary of State. That exercise coincides with bills being introduced into the current legislative session in Texas that are requiring documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration. So it's all part of a plan that's leading towards that legislative change.
Thank you. You know, in my community, we would call what you talk about a poll tax. And what you were talking about, Mr. Corbett, we used to say the more things change, the more they stay the same. Mr. Lujan.
Each of you touched on and described actions that are taking place now, same actions that were taking place whether it was in the 70s or prior. But I want to zero in on post-Shelby. If you could shed some light on specific actions in some detail, and I'll start, Chad, with you, with Mr. Dunn. Post-Shelby that are taking place now that are getting in the way, that are hurting people, that are discriminatory in practice, that clearly should be a violation of the Voting Rights Act.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, and obviously, I don't want to waste the committee's time, but the Beaumont situation is really one of the worst environments I have ever been in. When you go to a school board meeting in Beaumont today, all the white citizens sit on one side of the room, and all the black and Latino citizens sit on the other side of the room. Now, it's not forced by any authority, but that's how the community still operates. And the constables who are black and Hispanic stay on the white side of the room, and the white constables stay on the minority side of the room. And I made the mistake at one meeting of sitting down with a friend of mine who's an African-American citizen there. I was working on the school board issue, and I mean, I had white citizens shout me down, "You're sitting in the wrong spot," and say all kinds of nasty things to me about where this is today. This, I mean, you know, this is in the last 5 years. You go to a Beaumont ISD school board meeting today, and it'll look like this. So, you know, what happened in Beaumont, Galveston, and Jasper I just described to you would not have happened had Shelby County not been issued. There have been scores of polling place changes, some, you know, that we know of. I'm sure there's been hundreds that we don't know of that have material effects on people being able to get out to vote. There are a number of school districts and counties, more than I can, you know, list for you now, that are either going to at-large elections, which is a cornerstone method of discrimination in voting, is you elect at-large instead of districts. And some of them have done so, and I believe many more will follow. I have heard, I don't have direct evidence of it, but I have heard that after Shelby County, the state sent message to communities to take their time making changes, to roll it out slowly as a way to sort of hide the effects of it. And it looks to me like that's happened, but it doesn't change the very real injury that started the afternoon of, what was it, June 26, 2013, when Shelby County was issued, and continues every day since.
I would also add this issue of questioning the right to vote of people that have become naturalized citizens, starting to send letters to them, you know, we have a question about when you became a citizen, do you have proof and all that. I think that's going to have an adverse effect on many voters who might be scared. What, are they going to come after me? Maybe I made a mistake on the application, whatever. I think it's going to have an impact in chilling the person's right to vote.
Maybe I can say a little bit more about Section 5. The Texas Education Agency has the right to seize school districts and displace elected officials, take over school districts if they feel that there's a problem. Now, under Section 5, we almost completely prevented that from happening. Since the doing away with Section 5, the TEA has been seizing these school districts, and Beaumont was one of them. They seized the school districts, and you end up, Beaumont had a black superintendent, black board members, and now it's controlled by the whites. And
that's something you would have had to pre-clear before.
Yes.
That you don't.
And Mr. McCarthy, as time has run out here, what I'd ask is just if these instances, whether it's in Texas or with your experience in other parts of the country, if you could please submit those in writing to the chair. Thank you very much.
Certainly, those are the unintended consequences. Ms. Jackson, I'm sorry, Mr. Vela.
Thank you. I'm struck by a few things. The fact that this is the first hearing on this issue since 1982 in the state of Texas makes you realize and makes you appreciate Congresswoman Fudge's effort to bring this hearing to South Texas and shed light on this very important issue. Number two, I've heard of many of you over my last 3 terms in Congress, but except for Mr. Rios, had not had the opportunity to meet you individually. And I must say, now I get it. Your testimony has been so compelling and shed so much light on the battle that you consistently wage to protect the very people for which the Voting Rights Act was passed. Is something that we owe a great deal of we owe you a great deal for that. I must say, the other thing that strikes me is that I just began my 4th year in Congress. And believe it or not, to just give you an idea of the depth of experience that is visiting us here today, I am the junior member in this congressional delegation. And so, again, I thank all my colleagues for that as well. I have 2 questions real quick. I think, Mr. Rios, earlier when we were in the back, you wanted to shed some light on the issue of the census question and the status of that litigation as well.
Yes, real quickly, we did win a case in New York. I represented Hidalgo and Cameron County, where the judge struck the citizenship question from the census form, and it was a great victory. It's a 277-page opinion. One of the looming facts was 3 of the scientist experts in the Census Bureau had told Secretary Ross, you can't do it this way. Normally we test the question for a year, 2 years to make sure that it's effective and that it doesn't compromise accuracy. What you're doing here is going to compromise accuracy. Instead of having a 3% perhaps undercount in certain areas, we could have a 15% undercount, which means we're not doing an actual census. And that opinion was a great victory. Right now, the administration is trying to appeal directly to the Supreme Court because they don't have enough time to get it reversed by the Second Circuit because the ballots, the census forms have to start printing in June. Here's where you, the Congress, could get involved because you have a direct responsibility with the Census Bureau. You can tell them, look, forget about printing the ballot. The Office of Budget and Management also, they have to put up the expense. There's hearings on that going on right now. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and maybe Mr. Dunn, you can elaborate on this. I mean, why, just for the general public, I mean, why is this issue of the census question so important?
Well, so what's interesting is the American system was set up with large states and little states, as we all know from our history. And now we have this unique circumstance where you have a state like Texas that is actively working with the Census Bureau and folks to add a census question that will have the effect of reducing its political power, would result in fewer congresspeople or districts being assigned to the state, fewer electoral votes, and importantly, billions of fewer dollars would flow into the state as a result of an incorrect count. And what that shows is how out of sorts our political alignment in this country has come. No longer are we rural states and urban states and big states and small states, which our Constitution was set up. States are willing to sacrifice their own political power to do harm to minority voting rights. And that's what the census question is all about, is robbing from our citizens, our school district, our roads, money so that there's not more congresspeople from Texas that are elected from Latino and African American citizens.
One last question, Mr. Corbell. So as we wage this effort to protect voter rights, you sometimes hear, well, all you're doing is really trying to allow non-citizens to get a right to vote. How do we confront that question?
Well, I think it's very uncommon for a non-citizen to try and vote because what will happen is if they get caught, they'll be deported immediately. So there's just no incentive to do that. And there's also no incentive to turn out people to turn out a lot of undocumented people to vote. The closest election we've had in 20 years is the one we just had for the Senate, and that was almost 250,000 votes difference. Do you realize the size of fraud you'd have to do to deal with 250,000 votes? That'd be an enormous fraud. I mean, maybe 50 votes you could change, but you couldn't change 250,000.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. Representative Jackson Lee.
Madam Chair, thank you. And again, let me emphasize the historic nature of this hearing. And to our host, Congressman Vela, again, as we hold this hearing in South Texas, it is really because of the experts that we have before us really telling the history and story of the entire state of Texas. Let me again emphasize that the Honorable Barbara Jordan, who represented this district, would not have been elected had it not been for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. She went first to the state Senate. on a district-line Senate, and then off to the United States Congress. But let me pose questions based upon my being on the Judiciary Committee when the panic went out that the Voting Rights Act was getting ready to end, and we had to create 15,000 pages that brought about the bill signed by President George W. Bush, obviously a Republican, and to try to track this questioning of state action and how vile that is, and maybe the word should go out that we're under attack again, and let the horrors of those who bombarded my office and the United States Congress phone saying, don't let the Voting Rights Act go out. I think the message needs to go out. We need them now. And so I want to pursue this line of questioning very quickly. Each of you will be a yes or no answer. Do you consider Texas one of the major epicenters of voter suppression? I'm going one by one. I just need...
Absolutely.
Yes.
Very much so.
Yes.
Do you believe that state action is clearly part of that voter suppression?
Absolutely, Councilman.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say they're on the cutting edge of it here in this state.
Based on the holistic stories that you've been telling, let me go to this point. One, we know in the voter ID case, we had the Department of Justice documenting and supporting the position that Texas discriminated in redistricting. The voter ID law was discriminatory. You now know that we have a new announcement saying that the DOJ will flip and now support the state of Texas, where there's no intentional discrimination, which was found, and will indicate that we are no longer subject to pre-clearance Section 5, which obviously we've got to fix. It may take a little bit longer, but I'd appreciate...
within 2 hours...
Mr. Rios, yes.
Within 2 hours of the president swearing in, there was a notice filed in the federal court on the voter ID claiming that they were going to realign themselves within 2 hours.
What impact is that? When the people's lawyer, the federal law firm that was the instrument of change in the civil rights movement flips?
Has a tremendous impact because now you have the federal government weighing in on important questions of law, and it has an impact on federal judges and the public at large too.
Mr. Dunn, is there any basis for that flip? Is there any fact basis that should generate a flip to go against us in terms of saying no discrimination in Texas sufficient for preclearance?
None whatsoever. And I would point out that the Department of Justice, the only federal department named after an idea, has fought for voting rights since it was given the charge in the 1965 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And even during other Republican administrations, although they would take actions that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, we're consistent in enforcing voting rights, pursuing individual cases in communities. We've not seen any of that from the current administration.
I want to make the point that the bulk of the members on this panel, I would think my numbers are correct, are voting rights districts. And so two questions, you can take them, and what impact is demise and ending of the voting rights on the idea of one person, one vote, which is what we're supposed to be adhering to, number one. Number two, given the Shelby decision, what type of record do you think needs to be built that could pressure the Supreme Court in its present configuration that Section 5 preclearance is an absolute necessity to ensure one person, one vote, and to eliminate the intimidation that has come about through closing polling places, short hours, and, of course, purging?
Well,
document the record. It's very important, which is what you're doing.
The ability to influence and dilute others' votes is caustic to our democracy. And in the cut and thrust of politics, where sort of anything goes, as you know as well as you do in running for re-election and the various races you've had to face, it's hard for other candidates to not use a tool that's available to them. And the message that we are delivering lately is that diminishing the right to vote of people that don't support you as a candidate is a proper campaign method. And it's going to continue to increase until Congress, the Supreme Court, and government in general can do something about it. And so this is an important first step. It's my honor to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, if I may compliment you on your commentary with reference to the poll tax. Indeed, Texas has a poll tax. That's what it is. The question is, how do we acquire and present the empirical evidence to support our contention in a court of law? The poll tax exists. Texas will say, and I'm looking at the Department of Public Safety's website, they indicate on the website that you may acquire an EIC at no charge. That's an election identification certificate at no charge. But Mr. McCarthy, you've indicated that there is a charge associated with it, and I think we need to have you give some greater clarity as to what the charges are for the record. This will be a benefit to us at a later time.
Yeah. So what I was alluding to in that answer earlier was that, and I think other panel members have indicated that not every county in Texas has a Department of Public Safety branch, and in some instances, people have to travel long distances to get to a DPS office. They need to take time off work. They need to travel long distances, and they need to wait in line sometimes for hours and hours to get their election identification certificate. And so there may not be a financial cost in terms of acquiring the ID, but there's a significant cost for some people in terms of getting to an office, taking the time off work, waiting in line, and you know, the cost involved in that travel and wait time.
Because time is of the essence, let me ask you quickly, do you not have to have a birth certificate to acquire this ID?
I don't believe you do.
You have to have a birth certificate or to get one of the IDs. There's some substitutes for that, but by and large, most people get a birth certificate.
By and large, birth certificate. As you know, a good many people who live in Texas weren't born in Texas. The notion that the ID is at no cost is promulgated and promoted by Texas in that it will accord you your birth certificate if you're indigent. So they try to get around it. I tested the system myself. Here's how the system fails us and becomes a poll tax. I'm from Louisiana. Because I'm from Louisiana, when I went to vote and I chose not to use my proper ID, couldn't use my congressional ID, but I chose not to use a proper ID, I had to send to Louisiana to get my birth certificate. Texas doesn't cover the cost of a birth certificate from Louisiana. At that point, it becomes a tax because Texas has tried to eliminate the cost of the birth certificate when in fact I had to pay for the birth certificate to get my ID. The 5-day period that the Honorable Benny Thompson mentioned, not enough time to get an ID from Louisiana and bring it back to Texas to get the free ID card. The 24th Amendment, when it speaks to this notion of a poll tax, it not only talks about poll tax in those explicit terms, it also mentions something else. And this is where I think we have a great argument. It indicates shall not pay, failure to pay a poll tax, but then other tax, not just the word poll tax, but any other tax. The tax to buy your birth certificate is something that I think is onerous to the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. And at some point, I think we have to hone in on these nuances such as this. My friend, Mr. Dunn, your thoughts?
Two things about that. In the lawsuit, we actually brought a 24th Amendment claim. The district court ruled that it was in fact a poll tax, and then the Fifth Circuit overruled that part of the ruling. And we did ultimately prevail on other theories, and that's why there is the reasonable impediment declaration that allows you to get around it. But there's a ton of people in your situation. I'd like to talk to you just a second about a gentleman named Floyd Carrier, an African-American Korean War veteran who was born in a hospital on a county line in East Texas, and they didn't register his birth. So he can't get a birth certificate. It doesn't exist for him. And when the voter ID law went into effect immediately after Shelby County, he drove his tractor down to the polling location because he can't drive. He doesn't have a driver's license. He goes down there where everybody knows him. Hey, Mr. Carrier, how are you doing? And he says, can I vote? And they said, well, we need your ID. And he says, I don't have an ID. And they said, well, Mr. Carrier, we know who you are, but we're not allowed to let you vote anymore. A veteran of the armed forces in the Korean War was excluded from voting because of some mistake made at his birth in paperwork. And now he has to go through the reasonable impediment declaration process, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a separate but unequal and its own burdensome process. It's an improvement, but it's certainly no repair. So, yes, it's very much true that there continues to be a poll tax. It's not just that. On birth certificates, another example, we put people on buses in Houston, for example, and had them go get their birth certificate from certain addresses. And they'd stand in line, and sure enough, you'd be missing a document, and they'd have to go home. Some of them, it ended up taking 4 or 5 days, would be off work. These were people we had, got to do this. And then a different bus to the DPS station. Well, in Houston, the DPS location where you get your driver's license is not in the urban core. And for several people, it was 3 different bus routes and transfers, an all-day process. And sure enough, you get to DPS, you wait in line, you're an hour and a half, and you're missing one thing that wasn't on the website. So there's a whole lot of hassle, both financial time, money, lost time with family, that these kind of laws, and that's what they're designed to do, make it hard so that people won't do it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vela, thank you again for helping us to have this historic occasion.
Thank you. As I wrap up, let me just say a few things. One, of course, is your testimony has been enlightening. It has been at times disturbing and at times just egregious. It is something that I think every single citizen of this country needs to hear. I represent one of the poorest districts in America with a fairly large minority population. And what I know is that most people who are poor or who are of color, the only protection we have is the law. It is the courts. And so if you had an opportunity to say today to the Supreme Court why we need to reinstate fully the Voting Rights Act, each one of you just please tell me what that is, and we'll start with you, Mr. Rios.
I think as the minority community becomes more politically active, the power structure will make it more difficult for them to participate in the political process and continually violate the Constitution.
So you're basically saying if we allow people to their own devices, they will do things that are not right. Okay.
Well,
Mr. Corvo.
Congressman, I think it's really this chart showing how small the Anglo population is getting and how big the minority commission population is getting. The other side is simply afraid that they're going to lose control of the state. This kind of stuff is very disturbing to them.
And we'd like to also have a copy of your map in addition to that, because that is happening literally all over the United States. Mr. McCarthy.
Yeah, look, I said before that voting is the cornerstone on which all of our other civil liberties rest. And what we've heard today is ample evidence that people's right to vote is being curtailed in this state. People are having their vote suppressed. And so something really needs to be done to stop that.
Chief Justice Roberts said in the Shelby County opinion that nobody denies that there's racial discrimination in voting, and one circumstance is too many. But times have changed, and we certainly can't deny that. Times have changed for the better, sometimes for the worst. What I would say to the U.S. Supreme Court is, in all due respect, open your eyes and look at least what has happened since you made that choice. I believe these are people of integrity, and perhaps they live in different communities than I do and have different experiences. But open your eyes, because you have unleashed something that is hard to put back in the bottle.
I thank you also very much for your testimony. I thank my colleagues for their participation. We do have another panel, and I think we are right on time. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Pleasure to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, I'm excited about Manny stepping up.
Yeah, we are too.
Yeah,
I think he's got a good handle on what needs to be done.
I think so. I mean, it's a big job, but I think really highly of him, and I think he's been doing good work for a long time. So it's great.
What is the second panel on?
It's just me, and I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the perspective of individual voters and talking about voter registration, polling place access. So a little bit more of grassroots.
The suppressive effects of getting rid of straight ticket voting.
Yeah, I know. It's going to cause massive one, I know.
A lot of people will not, they're not going to wait 3 hours.
Oh.
So, Gilberto,
How are you?
old progressive credentials that you carry proudly. Thank you. What is their next scene? At Fort Brown? I mean, the Brownsville raid? Where are they going next?
They're going to do something on Black History Month.
That's tonight. That's what Cindy wanted me to go to this evening.
I didn't know it was tonight, but
Yeah.
let me take a picture of this.
Yeah, where is?
That's all right. I just want to get.
Who are those people behind them? Oh, those are witnesses. No, I heard it all. Excuse me, I didn't see their faces. I didn't see their faces.
If we could take our seats, we have one last witness that we have been waiting and excited to hear from. So if you would just please take your seats. I'm happy to, at this point, introduce Mimi Marziani, who is the chair of the Texas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Mimi, the floor is yours.
There we go. Wonderful. Well, good morning, everybody. It is a great honor to be here, so thank you for having me. My name is Mimi Marziani. As mentioned, I am the chairwoman of the Texas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. In addition, I'm the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, and on top of that, I'm an attorney. I am a professor of election law and voting rights. I'm a community leader, and maybe most importantly, I'm a mom of 2 young daughters, and I believe deeply that Texas can be better than what it is, and I care about the future of this state. I have 2 goals this morning for you. First, I want to highlight the significant ways in which continued discrimination against voters of color in Texas is undermining the promise embedded in our Constitution of equality and human dignity. My second goal in doing that is to give voice to some of the voters in Texas who have been affected and describe for each of you what that's really felt like for them and what that's looked like on the ground. I'm going to attempt to be concise, but of course I am happy to answer any questions you have. So first, discrimination in voter registration is persistent, and in fact and sadly it appears to be getting worse. We've heard quite a bit this morning about the unlawful purge of new citizens from the rolls, so I won't spend any more time on that except to share 2 points with you. This morning, the Texas Civil Rights Project, joined with the Texas ACLU and other organizations, filed suit against the state of Texas and several counties over this unlawful purge. We have a 50-page complaint that outlines a number of ways in which the state has violated the Constitution. Happy to answer questions about that litigation. The other point I wanted to make about the purge is maybe even more important. Last night, I had the pleasure of speaking with a woman named Sylvia. She's a naturalized citizen here in Texas, and she was interested in joining our lawsuit. She declined to do so, however, and the reason she declined is because she's scared. She's terrified in this sort of environment, in this state, that by speaking out, putting herself on the line, that she could face retaliation from the government. And I share that to describe the type of environment in which voters are operating. So a couple other examples of discrimination in voter registration. Since at least 2011, Texas has worked to eliminate grassroots voter registration drives. I heard a number of you talk about voting rights in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and so you know that voter registration drives have been a really incredibly important way to bring new people into the electorate, particularly young people and persons of color. Sadly, in Texas, it's a crime to register your neighbor to vote unless you've jumped through a lot of hoops and have gotten deputized by the state. The very predictable result of this regime has been the elimination of this sort of grassroots effort. And unfortunately, that has led to ridiculous situations, such as, for example, in 2016, in the city of San Antonio, a city with a population of more than 1.5 million, there were under 1,000 people eligible to register somebody else to vote. Third failing of voter registration that I wanted to highlight was the Secretary of State's persistent failure to enforce a state law requiring that high schools register to vote young people. And this has been something the state has refused to enforce in recent years despite public outcry, despite the fact that 72% of our high school students in Texas are persons of color themselves. And despite the fact that the state's inaction is causing literally hundreds of thousands of young people every year to go unregistered and therefore not be able to participate in our democracy. Finally, I wanted to highlight that Texas has been refusing, in addition, to comply with federal voter registration law, namely the Motor Voter Act. By not complying with the National Voter Registration Act, when people go online to update their driver's license, 1.5 million Texans annually are missing an opportunity to register to vote. This, quite frankly, hits the entire population, but it hits frequent movers even harder because it means that as they move, they are no longer registered at their current address. Frequent movers tend to be poorer and younger, and therefore in Texas, they are much more likely to be people of color. The culmination of all of this discrimination in voter registration has had significant consequences. First, we know that there are millions of people in Texas who are eligible to be registered to vote, but they are not, meaning that they just cannot participate. They are just shut out of the process. In addition, the people who are on the rolls don't represent us. The people on the rolls in Texas are older and whiter than the citizen voting age population as a whole, and so it has skewed the entire political process. I see I'm out of time. Okay. So one note on the motor voter piece. I did want to share the story of a woman named Tatsia Watkins. She's a black mother of two from Irving, Texas, in the Dallas area. And she worked very hard to move herself to a new neighborhood with better schools. She dutifully went online to try to update her driver's license and register herself to vote. When she showed up at the polls in 2014 to try to cast her first ever vote in a midterm election, she wasn't able to cast a ballot that counts. And this happened in front of her daughters, and she honestly cannot talk about it without tearing up. So again, that is what this sort of discrimination looks like on the ground. And as some of the other panelists mentioned, when that sort of thing happens to a person, they are much less likely to go and try to vote again. In my written testimony, I also talk about a medley of problems that happen once folks actually show up at the polling place and try to vote, including long lines, changed polling places, mismanagement, and good old-fashioned voter intimidation. I'm happy to talk about that further during the question period, but I'll stop my opening.
Thank you very, very much. We've been joined by our colleague, Mr. Vesey. Thank you so much. We are glad that you made it, Mark. Why don't we begin the questioning as we've gone the same way that we went before. We would start with Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much. One of the challenges we've had with the Motor Voter Act is there's no requirement that if I'm registered at a state agency, there's no timeline for me to transfer that data to a local registrar. And so that has compounded the problem because some people went to get driver's license, registered to vote, but that information didn't get transferred to the local registrar. And so when they go vote, they're told you're not registered. So that's one of the things that we're trying to look at also to see should we put a time limit on the agency to transfer that registration data. Have you run into that?
So, in fact, there is a time limit in the existing National Voter Registration Act. That already exists. Unfortunately, what you're highlighting is that there is rampant noncompliance. And one thing that has been really unfortunate in recent years is the Department of Justice has completely stopped enforcing the National Voter Registration Act, and you see a lot of states that are not in compliance.
Yeah, well, when we approached my state, Mississippi, they talked about the capacity issue and the ability to do it, but I'm happy to know that. The other part of that question is, have you found that when officials are trained to conduct elections, most states don't have standards. You know, if you're somebody's friend, they pick you to work the election. How is it in Texas, to your knowledge?
Yes. So in Texas, poll workers are usually appointed by the local political party. And to your point, there are very few standards on who is able to be a poll worker. They're paid very little. The training is haphazard. And the result of that is pretty gross mismanagement of the polling locations. And I've included this in my testimony, but one very blatant example, during the 2016 election, during the 2018 election, so just a couple months ago, in Harris County, home to Houston, there were at least 9 polling locations that opened more than an hour late, all of them located in communities of color. And when we called the local county clerk and said, action needs to be taken, we were told that, no, we shouldn't worry about it. These sort of problems are typical for Election Day, even though countless folks were just, they couldn't stand in line for hours and hours. And ultimately, we sued, representing a community organizing group here in Texas, and we were able to get the polls opened for another hour. But that's one example of and people slept in, they didn't know how to turn on the machines. They were really basic things, but it comes from having folks who are not professionals, who are not properly being trained, they're not properly being supervised, they're not properly being
So
paid.
you would recommend some standardization of a training regimen for election workers?
Absolutely, and not just me. In 2012, you might recall President Obama saying that we need to do something about long lines, and there was a bipartisan commission that he convened, and they issued a report. And one of the things in that report, as unsexy as it sounds, was exactly around poll workers and looking at how many problems are caused at the polls by the lack of professional poll workers. And there's a whole list of things in that report that we could do.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Johnson.
Have you had an opportunity to look at the different applications for driver's license in any one state, any more than one state? Like Texas versus any other state?
With regards to the motor voter law, you mean?
Yes, because the driver's license now in Texas focus more on voting rights than they do on driving. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if we could compare that to any other state.
One thing I will say in Texas is that the Department of Public Safety, which is in charge of driver's license, they have been extraordinarily hostile to the notion that they need to comply with the motor voter law or that they need to issue voter IDs to people. And so I'm not sure how that compares to other states, but that has been a significant problem. With regards to what I spoke about, the failure to offer voter registration when folks go online and update their driver's license, as 1.5 million Texans do every single year. That problem, you do see it in some other states, but it is much less of an impact in other states because many other states have online voter registration. In Texas, we have taken no steps to modernize voter registration, so you don't have any online voter registration, and in addition, when people go online to update their driver's license, they're not getting the benefit of their rights under the National Voter Registration Act. So there's this double whammy.
Thank you very much. Pass.
Mr. Lujan.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I was intrigued by the aspects of your testimony regarding young voters in the state of Texas. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that and again remind us of the percentage of people of color currently in high school? I think you said 72%.
Yep.
But exactly what this means in making it harder for young people to get registered or to participate in voting in the state of Texas.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned in my testimony, I think there's one really important background fact for the panel to consider is that race, age, and class closely correspond here in Texas. And so one statistic, when you look at Texans under 40, it's almost 60% Black or Latinx and 35% Anglo. When you go over 40, that flips. You're about 56% Anglo, 38% Black or Latinx. And so by definition, when you're talking about young people in Texas, you are talking about a population that is majority minority. Similarly, as we saw in the voter ID litigation, poorer folks in Texas are more likely to be people of color. So all these things correspond very closely. When you get even younger, so under 20, the statistics are even more pronounced. And as I mentioned before, 72% of high school students in Texas are persons of color. And that's one of the many reasons that we are so concerned by the state's persistent failure to enforce our very own Texas law requiring that Texas high schools offer voter registration twice a year.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Mr. Vela.
Mr. Vesey, I'm no longer the junior member in this delegation. Mr. Vesey, Mr. Joaquin Castro, and Beto O'Rourke and I were all elected at the same time, and Mr. Vesey was one of the first people out front on the issue of voting rights. And given our time constraints, what I'd like to do is go ahead and yield my 5 minutes to Mr. Vesey so he can take this full 10.
Mr. Vesey, you're recognized.
Phil, thank you very much. Madam Chair, thank you. This is really appropriate that we're holding this hearing in Texas. As you know, from the time of Reconstruction until the Voting Rights Act was passed, Texas had as oppressive voting laws as any state in the union, including the three deep southern states that are often mentioned when it comes to voter suppression. But something happened after the Voting Rights Act passed to where Texas became one of the leaders in the expansion of voter rights. I mean, you look at, for instance, straight ticket voting, being able to vote anywhere in your county during the early voting period, just making it so easy for voters to be able to cast their ballot. And then, of course, over the last decade or so, we've regressed. We have now become one of the very worst states, including this voter ID bill that has been talked about. And then a lot of other things that have happened that people aren't quite sure about yet, especially outside of the state. One is that we ended straight ticket voting. And the amazing thing about us ending straight ticket voting is that when I was in the state legislature, the Republicans and Democratic activists and organizations, they came to testify before Austin begging us to not end straight ticket voting. And of course, the lieutenant governor's son lost an election in Harris County in Houston, and they get rid of straight ticket voting, which was so easy and convenient for so many people. And of course, a lot of people think that that's meant to hurt people in the African American community. We also had things that people, again, because luckily they didn't become law, but in the House, when I was in the House, they actually passed a piece of legislation that said that you could only register to vote if you had a passport or a birth certificate. I don't know how many voter registration drives would be successful if you had to have one of those two on you. I doubt very many people have their passport or birth certificate on them in this room right now. And my question specifically to you is, what steps do you think, or what areas do you see Democrats and Republicans in the Texas legislature being able to work together to maybe perhaps, do some good common sense legislation that would actually increase confidence that people, especially elected officials in the state, care about people being able to cast their ballot and the right to vote?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question. Two things I would point to that I think are very much common sense reforms. One is allowing online voter registration. There's scores of evidence from across the country right now. More than, I think it's 42 other states have online voter registration. It saves money. It makes the polls more accurate. It transfers power to the voter themselves because they can check the accuracy of their records and update them. And it increases security. So that is one thing that, you look at other states, it's very much been a bipartisan effort. I think a second thing that I would really hope we could find bipartisan agreement would be around professionalizing the polling place. And so I do think that includes poll worker training, but it also includes updating our voting technology. Most of the voting machines here in Texas were purchased in 2002. I will admit, in 2002, I was not a lawyer. I didn't, none of us had iPhones. Just think about what you were doing in 2002 and how far back we were. And so no surprise, they're on their last legs. And that's why our voting machines are doing things like flipping people's votes entirely. And that was confirmed in the 2018 election, that people polling straight ticket Democrat, it was flipping to straight ticket Republican, and vice versa. So those are two places where I would really hope we could see some bipartisan agreement.
Speaking of professionalizing the polling place, could you explain to everybody here why it would be a bad idea to allow people to remain anonymous when they report as poll workers? We had an organization several years ago known as the King Street Patriots, this right-wing conservative organization that was trying to get a bill passed that said that that people that are coming to observe, that poll watchers need not show any identification or fill out any forms, that they should just be able to show up and anonymously be poll watchers. Can you explain to everybody why that's a bad idea?
Yes, I will give two examples, in fact. One involves a member of the King Street Patriots, Alan Vera, who in August 2018, so just a couple months ago, actually submitted to the Harris County Voter Registrar's Office 4,000 challenges of registered voters in Houston. And he based it not on personal knowledge, as the law required, but on his own assumptions built into the addresses people had provided. And we are still actually examining all of those addresses for patterns, but I can tell you a lot of them come from communities of color, and a lot of them are folks who are very, very poor, who are living in churches, homeless shelters, places like that, and they had submitted those addresses as you are allowed to. And one of the reasons that he did this blanket challenge is because he didn't actually have to stand up and say that he had personal knowledge for every single one. And so I think that's the type of thing you could expect if you allow things to be anonymous. Secondly, I think that it is just contrary to notions of justice and due process, and quite frankly, the type of political dialogue that we should have. There's a great case from a couple years ago where people were trying to shield their identity when they were signing controversial ballot initiatives, and Justice Scalia actually said that hiding your identity in these types of situations hardly resembles the land of the brave. And I think that that's the other piece of it, that it's not fair, and it can't actually promote the type of political dialogue that all of us would want.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Mr. Veazey. We thank you for your leadership on the voter ID legislation that obviously is one of the centerpieces of dealing with voter equality, which I'd like to call. Let me thank you very much for your leadership, and I might refer to some points that you made in your testimony. I'd just like to refer to them again, that your testimony here today is to highlight the continued discrimination in Texas against voters of color, which you believe undermines equality and human dignity. So I ask you the question, do you believe that Texas is one of the major epicenters of voter suppression?
Not only do I believe that, it is the number one reason that I transferred my legal career from New York to Texas.
Thank you. And do you believe that part of that suppression, or all of it, or much of it, is state action driven?
Yes.
And your other point made here, and I'm going to follow a line of questioning, is you talk about the fact that race, age, and socioeconomic status are closely correlated in Texas. And here's your exact language. African Americans and Hispanics are more likely than Anglos to be living in poverty because they continue to bear the social economic effects caused by decades of racial discrimination. Do you agree with that?
That's actually the court's language in VC versus Perry. So yes, absolutely.
And with that in mind, they bear the brunt. And I think it's important to note Hispanics and African Americans as a group. And therefore, it is important for that coalition around these issues to be strong. But you believe that that is ongoing at this point?
Absolutely. And I would add there's also pretty rampant discrimination against the Asian American community as well.
So let me raise these questions. One, you gave some history, but I remember in the voter ID law that we were experiencing the panic in rural areas of DPS offices closing up or not being available, number one, if you will comment on that. In the recent 2018 election, you may realize in the early vote, which we pride in Texas, Hispanics and African Americans in particular have jobs that really don't release them, or they don't get off until 5, 6 or so, and their normal thinking about elections are the polls are open till 7. Our local officials close the polls at 4 p.m. Mm-hmm. You might comment on how horrific that is in terms of people's mindset. Also, the issue of humiliation. I've experienced that, and I think you had in your testimony the question of a Latino person who was told to get after they confiscated her passport, which in the context of ID, it was a legitimate form of ID. If you can just answer those three, and I have a follow-up question.
Absolutely. First, yes, DPS offices are often located at very great distances for citizens, which makes it extraordinarily hard for them to get the ID that they need. So you're absolutely correct. Early voting is a very important way for people to have the flexibility to be able to get to the polls, especially if they have young children, if they work jobs that are inflexible, for all sorts of other reasons. I'll note that we were very concerned in 2018, even though there was advance warning that this was going to be a high turnout election in Texas, and it was, that because of the mismanagement of polling places, we saw long lines even during early voting. I have this in my testimony, people waiting an hour in San Antonio, an hour in Burnett, an hour in LaPorte, 2 hours in Austin, 2.5 hours in Houston, 3 hours in Corpus Christi. And so those are significant problems during early voting. Finally, on pages 6 and 7 of my testimony, I include some pretty horrific stories that voters experienced when they were seeking to vote, many of them at the hands of election workers. And one I'll highlight, a brown-skinned voter in Kingswood gave her driver's license to a poll worker who asked her how long she had been in the U.S. She responded that she was a naturalized citizen from Canada. The poll worker said, "Welcome to America." He then asked the same question of the voter's mom, but then did not ask that question of any of the light-skinned people standing in line.
Let me conclude, Madam Chair, if you'll let me get this last question in. This is an editorial by the Houston Chronicle that indicates the governor owes an apology for ham-fisted try at voter suppression. It reads, the Secretary of State should probably resign after issuing an advisory on January 25th, flagging 95,000 of the state's registered voters as potential non-citizens. At least 58,000 of those people have voted at least once since 1996, he said. But my question is, tying this in, and given the fact that only 68% of Texans are registered to vote because of suppression and intimidation, given the Shelby decision, your experience, what type of record do we need to continue to build to ensure that the Supreme Court, no matter its configuration, more Republican appointees, realizes that Section 5 needs to be reinstituted?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. I worked in the testimony to try to provide as many contemporaneous examples as possible. I will say that in addition to what's in the testimony that I submitted around voter registration and polling access, the report that the Texas State Advisory Committee issued and presented to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights last year, our report also has, I think, 10 pages of findings, and that was a bipartisan group that concluded at the end of the day that, Texas, to put it simply, that Texas is not a red state or a blue state. Texas is a non-voting state, and the reason we're a non-voting state is because of these systemic barriers that have been put in front of the voters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witness for appearing. Your testimony has been invaluable. I'm a son of the segregated South. I know what it's like to be suspect because of your appearance. I know what invidious discrimination looks like. I've seen the Klan with the robe in my community. I know what it smells like. I was forced to go to filthy colored waiting rooms at restaurants and various other places. And I know what it sounds like. I've been called ugly names. So I understand what being a suspect, just by virtue of who you are, is like. And what I see happening to the Latino community is very painful, because the Latino community now is being suspect. What's happening at the southern border, asylees being called terrorists. The whole notion that Latinos somehow are illegal by virtue of the titles that are being accorded them by public officials. When you call people illegal, you then say something can happen to them because of their status. The notion that you can purge the rolls by coordinating your effort with the Department of Public Safety And if a person happened to have registered to acquire a license as a potential citizen, not a citizen at the time, permanent resident, there's no law that requires you to later on go back and acknowledge that you're now a citizen. So you become suspect by simply having acquired a driver's license as a permanent resident. This type of behavior from public officials, we're not talking about just lay people, but from public officials, has to have an impact on the way people participate in a participatory democracy. And that's what we have. So the question for you is, given all of these things that are being used as tools against the Latino community, does this in and of itself create a form of suppression in terms of a willingness to register, a willingness to go to the polls and vote? Does this behavior from public officials have an invidious, insidious, if you will, impact upon Latino voters?
Absolutely. Two comments. One, thank you for sharing that. I'm also a child of the South, and that's why I know that racial discrimination is alive and well. Secondly, yes, you are absolutely right. And I actually am going to point to something that might seem on its face to be outside of the voting rights sphere, but the SB 4 law that was passed by the legislature in 2017. Now, as I see a lot of nods, SB 4 is a sanctuary city and show me your papers bill. And that is indeed what it does. But in addition, SB 4 seeks to sow fear in Latino communities. And in that litigation, the Texas Civil Rights Project represents a number of community organizing groups. And what they shared with us is that because of SB 4, they had members who suddenly were afraid to go into the public sphere and speak out. They were afraid to go to rallies. They're afraid to register other people to vote. And so, yes, I agree with you absolutely. And I think that it's not just the voter ID bill or these unlawful purges. It's also things like SB 4 that are contributing to this environment of fear and suppression that is just poisonous for our democracy.
Final point, and I have very little time, but the tone and tenor of the political debate often emanates from the top. Presidents said some ugly things. How has that tone and tenor trickled down to the people who have the right to exercise the vote?
Well, one thing we can look at is the rampant misinformation. For instance, the claim that voter fraud is some sort of systemic problem, which we've discussed, has no factual basis. I'll point to a very recent example. We've noted that the Texas Secretary of State, in sending out this advisory that 95,000 people are suspects, to use your word, although that was not rooted in sound data. Well, almost immediately after that went out, 11 days ago on January 25th, the President of the United States tweeted that there were 60,000 people who had voted illegally in Texas. It is just without factual basis. But I find it hard to believe that couldn't. People trust their elected officials, and so surely that has led many people to believe that there is, in fact, these rampant problems when, in fact, there's no basis at all.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I put something on the record?
Yes.
I want to ask for an answer to it. I just want to put it on the record. The witness, Ms. Marzani, indicated Asian voters, and that speaks clearly as much as Hispanics to the language question. Mm-hmm. And more of it has come because of lack of Section 5. But I want to add to the record that Texas changed its voting process that had been in for decades, straight ticket. And of course, people will view that as partisan or political, but it was used by Republicans and Democrats, and it was put in, when I say straight ticket, the elimination of straight ticket voting. It's used by Republicans and Democrats, but more importantly, it is a tool that sometimes illiterate voters are able to use, or disabled voters are able to use. And so we had no Section 5 pre-clearance on the elimination of the straight ticket, which I believe will disenfranchise maybe hundreds of thousands and maybe 1 million voters plus, because it impacts individuals who may be illiterate, who have a language issue, and as well may be disabled. And I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As we prepare to close, I have one question and then I'd wrap up. Is there something that you, or could you briefly just tell us what your protection program really is and how it functions?
Yes. So the Texas Civil Rights Project is really proud to spearhead a statewide, nonpartisan election protection effort, and we've been doing so since 2016. That entails dozens of organizations, most of us here in Texas, but also with some help from some national counterparts. And we put volunteers outside of polling locations to answer questions and collect problems. We run a hotline available in a number of different languages for voters to call us and ask questions and report problems. And then we train and deploy a group of attorneys who are ready to do things like sue a county, the example I gave, to keep polls open later on Election Day. I have a number of examples in my testimony of some of the calls we received, what voters told us. We received over 4,200 calls in 2018, and we, forthcoming, have a report that will document in greater detail what we heard from the voters in 2018. We compiled a similar report after the 2016 election that is linked in my testimony.
Thank you very much. That is great work. As we close, let me just say a couple of things. One is, as you talked about young people, in my district, we have a morning where students come to vote, an early vote. I meet those buses. I ask them how they feel when they go in, and I ask them how they feel when they come out. There's a great sense of pride when young people go and vote. And so I'm hopeful that we will continue to deal with that situation. And lastly, I would say to those who are listening, as well as to those who would continue to try to stop us from voting, that this is still the land of the free and the home of the brave. We are still the country that decides what democracies we recognize. We are still the country that wants to spread democracy all over the world. So I would say to Justice Roberts, give us the ballot, because it is a shame that the country that calls itself the light on the hill would treat its own citizens this way. And I would close and say thank you all so very much. This session of the Committee on House Administration is adjourned.